In today's macro photography tutorial, we're exploring pine cones. I've got a lovely big bag of different types of pine cone here, and these are really interesting when you get up close with a macro lens. We're not using a traditional macro lens today though, but I'll tell you more about that in just a sec. Hi guys, I'm Ben from Adaptalux and welcome back to another macro photography tutorial where today we are shooting pine cones. They're really interesting, especially when you get up close and when you use some creative lighting, which is what we're going to be exploring today. We're going to be exploring these pine cones up close. So we're using a macro lens of sorts, but this is the type of macro lens that you can easily afford. It's in fact going to transform our standard kit lens that comes with our camera into a macro lens. I am of course talking about the Raynox DCR-250. This is a clip-on adapter. This is going to clip onto the front of your standard kit lens on your camera and transform it into a much higher magnification lens and allow you to get much closer to your subjects. In comparison to buying a dedicated macro lens like my 100mm f2.8 Tamron here, this thing gets really close, but it's also very expensive. This, on the other hand, will set you back less than £100 or $100 to clip it onto any of the lenses that you already have. We'll talk more about exactly what that does, take a look through the lens and see what shots we can get as we go along. First of all, I'm going to take a closer look up at my pine cones without using any macro lens at all. So we've got a few different pine cones here. They're actually coming out of this bag, which was intended as a Christmas decoration, but has not been put away for, well, more than half a year now. So I think it's time that we make use of it as a macro subject. This is full of all very similar pine cones, but all different shapes and sizes. I do have a couple of different types as well to take a look at. But if I take a look at these through my standard lens, which is a Sony 28 to 70mm f3.5 to 5.6 standard kit lens. This thing came with the Sony a7 III as standard, and it really doesn't get very close at all. So if I try and focus on these pine cones, this is as close as I can get while still being in focus, and that is zoomed all the way in. If I zoom all the way out, we can get a little bit closer in terms of our working distance, but it still leaves these pine cones looking really rather small in our frame. Now the answer to this, of course, is to be using our DCR-250. This thing just clips onto the front of my my lens here, and you can see as I'm zoomed all the way out, it's actually leaving a big ring around the edge of my image. If I zoom all the way in, however, you'll see that we're able to get much closer. We can actually get down to macro level of these pine cones now and still be able to focus while being much closer to the subject. There is still a limit to how close this lens can focus, but we can still get really close, interesting images of the detail on these pine cones. Now they're not looking too interesting at the moment because, well, I've not got any lighting on them, but I'm sure that we can get some really interesting shots. Now, the one thing that does change with clipping on this lens is our autofocus capabilities. It does still autofocus, but you do need to be within a relatively small range. You'll see if I move too far away now, I'm not able to focus properly on that pine cone. But as I move closer in, my autofocus does find itself, and I can very easily keep autofocusing on the different parts of the pine cone. Whether or not I'm still going to use autofocus, I'm not sure. I do tend to like using manual focus when doing macro photography, so I might be switching the autofocus off, but it is certainly a handy thing to have as a beginner that your now macro lens can still do autofocus. Many macro lenses don't even have autofocus capabilities because generally they're not required. So that's a very interesting quirk of using a converter like this, that you're able to maintain the capabilities of your lens while still getting a lot more magnification. So while my pine cones are more interesting up close than they are further away with that standard kit lens, I think we can make them a little bit more interesting with the addition of some lighting. Now, I'm of course going to be using the Adaptalux Studio lighting system here, which is designed especially for macro photography. Into this control pod, we can plug in flexible lighting arms, which then can be bent into position and placed exactly where we need them to be to create interesting effects on these really detailed surfaces of the pine cones. Now we can have up to 5 lighting arms at once in this system, so we can combine different colors of light from different directions. We can diffuse them and change the colors by snapping on filters and diffusers onto the ends of these lights. So I'm going to grab one of my pine cones, set it down on my table apart from the others, and then add some lighting around the pine cone to see what kind of interesting effects, shadows and highlights we can create on the textured surface of these really interesting subjects. So as you can see, what I'm doing here is placing down 2 different colors of lighting arms. I'm leaving these completely undiffused, so we've got a harsh green color coming from this way and an amber orange color coming from this way. I'm shining them just across the top of these pine cones so that we get that contrasting color on the various parts of elevation across the top of the pine cone. I think this makes for a really interesting image where you can pick out the 2 different colors on the different areas of the pine cones, and especially up close where you can't see any of this surrounding light. That makes things very interesting to look at, and it catches the eye quite nicely. It's also leaving nice patches of shadow where the light can't quite reach, and I think all of this in combination makes for a really nice composition. I mentioned potentially turning off my autofocus when using this adapter, and that's because it does tend to mess with your camera's capability to find your point of focus. If you're trying to get as close as you possibly can, then you're going to be sat right on the edge of the new working distance of this lens with the DCR-250 attached. And if you stray over that boundary, then the camera is going to really struggle to try and find its focal point, and it's going to send your image out of focus for a couple of seconds. You'll find yourself moving forward and back throughout the image to try and find where the camera wants to focus, and it's far easier to turn off your autofocus altogether, set that minimum value on your manual focus, and then your focal point will stay exactly where it is. You can then find your focus in your image by moving the camera forward and back. That's much easier than having the guesswork of say, well, we have maybe 20 centimeters of working distance in front of my lens, and if I stray to 19 centimeters, it's going to throw my image out of focus because the autofocus is getting confused. So I recommend, at least when you're shooting in a situation like this, to turn off your autofocus, set your focus manually, and then focus your image by moving your camera or your subject backwards and forwards. Now, the same principles of depth of field still apply to using a lens like this. So if you want a more shallow depth of field, then you need to set your aperture to a smaller number. If you want more of your image in focus at once, then you need a higher f number. This is particularly easy when you have a lens like this, which can digitally change its aperture. A lot of my other lenses, again, have manual aperture rings, so you have to set your aperture on the lens rather than in the camera. But because this is a standard kit lens that came with the camera, it communicates with the camera, and you can set all of your aperture settings along with your other 2 exposure settings in the camera itself. I'm really enjoying shooting these pine cones with different colored light coming from different directions. It is critical to get up close though. This is not an interesting effect if you're wide out, as you might be if you're shooting some other things in your garden like flowers. You can probably get away with using just your standard kit lens. However, for something like this where we're really focusing on those abstract details of the swirls and the structure that these things are made up of, you definitely want to get close up and try to obscure the the overall image. You don't want people looking at your shot and thinking, well, that's a pine cone sat on a table. You want people to think for a moment and decide whether or not they are indeed looking at a pine cone, and getting close is a really easy way to achieve that. Now, there is a way for us to get even closer. I've been talking so far from the perspective of somebody that's maybe wanting to try out macro and doesn't have a dedicated macro lens. However, the DCR-250 can also be clipped onto a macro lens. If you want a little bit more magnification on, say, your dedicated macro lens, you can clip this onto your macro lens and get even closer. I'm going to swap my lens out now and see the difference between having an extra little bit of magnification. So I've changed out the colors of my my lights here so that we've got a red and an orange, sort of a fiery effect on my pine cone. And you can see here that with my Tokina 100mm f2.8 macro lens, we can get really close onto these spines of the pine cone. However, what if you want to get a little bit closer? Well, we can try our DCR-250, and you'll see that straight away puts things really out of focus, and I again have to get much closer into my image to find that focus. You'll see that I'm still focusing by moving in and out. My focus is set to its minimum distance, and now I'm much closer to my subject, both in terms of magnification and physically much closer to the subject with the end of my lens. So you'll see that using a DCR-250 on a macro lens is very viable, just to push your magnification a little bit further in those cases where you need to get a little bit more detail and a little bit closer to your subject. As I've already mentioned, this DCR-250 is a really handy thing to have in your pocket if you're wanting to go out for, say, a walk in the woods and you're taking your kit lens with you instead of a dedicated macro lens. Maybe you don't want to carry around a full bag with a selection of lenses, but you happen upon some interesting mushrooms or some foliage or a flower that you want to get nice and close to. You can just whip out a DCR-250, pop it on the front of your standard lens and get that much closer image just for the sake of a few extra grams in your pocket. I've done this before. I went for a nice walk in the woods looking for mushrooms to test out our flash lighting, and I got some fantastic shots of mushrooms using this exact setup that I've been using today. I'll link to that video up in the top right hand corner if you want to see some more examples of images shot with a kit lens and the DCR-250. Now we actually have a bundled product with our lighting and the DCR-250 included in a single package. I'll link to that down in the description and up in the top right hand corner if you want to check out how you can get a lot more light into your images while also having a little bit of extra versatility with some extra clip-on magnification. I know this video is focused mostly on that nifty little DCR-250 because I wanted to try this out on a subject that I've shot before. I actually shot pine cones, well, several years ago now, exploring this technique of multi-directional colored light to create areas of darkness and shadow and that contrasting color across the surface of a really detailed and interesting subject. I'll link to that video at the end of this one so that you can go and check out a little bit more pine cone photography if you've been tempted by what you've seen here today. I hope you enjoyed this video, and do let me know down in the comments if you want to see more exploration of different subjects using a simple combo of a kit lens and a DCR-250, or if you've been inspired to get a DCR-250 to attach it to your standard macro lens, then do let me know down below. If you've enjoyed the video, make sure to hit the like button. But that is all I've got time for now. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.